Right, so I'm Lynn Jamieson, the chairperson of Scottish CND. I think it's very important that we talk about nuclear tests because it's often said, oh, nuclear bombs were only used twice at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but of course there have been over 2,000 nuclear explosions and they have caused terrible harm. And I think as Stephen is testifying, that harm continues. So the aim of the talk is to recover some of the history, which is one of harm, not glory or public good, and to review what we know about the extent of harm and the contribution that Britain has made to that, or to trying to put it better, and to hear the voices of the people who were most harmed. And they at least raise the issue of remediation, of what maybe we should be doing. So at the beginning, I need to say that the history of British nuclear testing is very bound up with the history of the United States. Um, I'm sure you know Britain and the United States and Canada, the scientists together worked on the Manhattan Project and the first bomb. But then immediately or very quickly after the war, the United States passed an act that excluded Britain from further joint working. And various scientists immediately had tried to get politicians to agree to ban the bomb then, right at the beginning. But they wanted to go ahead, the Americans wanted to go ahead, and so did the British, and to develop even bigger bombs. And so the British, when they were excluded from the American program, started their own, initially secretly without telling the public, and then eventually got far enough on to be able to start testing. And then after 12 years, the United States signed with the United Kingdom a defence agreement officially reinstating the nuclear cooperation. It was because it was in both interests at that time. The Americans wanted access to bases that the British had, and the British wanted access to missiles that they'd failed to develop and needed help from the Americans. And so they restart testing until we get to 1963, where there is a partial test ban, which formally is called Treaty Banning Nuclear Weapons Tests in the Atmosphere, in Outer Space and Underwater, which stopped the United States, United Kingdom and Russia from testing straight away once it was signed, and eventually all the nuclear states except, well, more recently North Korea, perhaps as well. No, their tests are not atmospheric; they're underground. So they did stop the atmospheric tests, and then it's 96 before you get the full test ban, although that treaty has never been completely entered into force. That's just a bit of quick background. And these two books I've found quite helpful. The book by Becky Alexis Martin reminds us about the deliberate silence about radiation after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in the immediate weeks and months or so following, the New York Times, for example, published over 100 articles without a single mention of ionizing radiation. And the book on the left about political fallout stresses that the partial test ban treaty came about despite the nuclear powers trying to minimize the harms of fallout. So nuclear testing was sending radiation all around the planet. And in a sense, everybody was becoming a downwinder of nuclear tests, although, of course, some people were much more victims than others because of their proximity to the tests. But everybody in the whole planet was being exposed to some radiation by nuclear tests. But when the word about this was out, the nuclear powers tried to say, well, it's only a tiny dose. And indeed, relative to other forms of radiation, even in the present, it's a small dose. It is minor compared to other doses, but the idea that innocent bystanders might have to be harmed to support this didn't go down well with the public when people started to question and fight back. And so the book on the left is describing that process and how it came to be a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving my slides on now. Here we go. So this shows you where all of the tests were in the world. And given what I've just said about the importance, particular importance of atmospheric tests in terms of the pollution that they were causing and the harm that that was causing in terms of sending radiation everywhere, you see on the left of the slide a little table of who did the most atmospheric tests. And the United States and Soviet Union were almost even Stevens. France actually did more atmospheric testing, and the UK and China are pretty well even Stevens. But in terms of the history of it, Britain was the third country in the world to start testing and carried on over a very long period from 52 to 91. And you can see that they conducted tests in Australia and also the Pacific and in the United States using the test site in Nevada, the United States. And all of these places were on lands of indigenous peoples. And all of them, although they were maybe in the bigger scheme of things, not by any means the largest number, every single one of them did significant harm to local people and whole regions. So this slide is kind of illustrating some of the significance of the atmospheric tests. So the little badge, which would be about the size of a CND badge, was given to children who sent in their milk teeth, the deciduous teeth, the teeth that fall out. Washington University began a project in 1958 collecting these teeth from children in St. Louis, Missouri. And St. Louis, Missouri was chosen because the pattern of wind from the main test sites in Nevada and New Mexico and rainfall meant that there was a lot of deposit of radiation in the Midwest, which then gets eaten by any grass-eating creature, ends up, for example, concentrated in milk, in things that people eat, in vegetables. And teeth there's a nuclear radioactive isotope that's created by an explosion, strontium-90, and it was known to be an isotope that would go to bone. And teeth and bone of the similar process, so it would be found in teeth if it was getting into people. And they wanted to start as soon as possible in 58 when they got the idea, because about the oldest age at which you lose your teeth is about 13. And they wanted to try and get 13-year-old teeth in particular, the ones that fall out, because that would mean that they might have a chance of getting some children who were born before the atmospheric tests, and where these teeth were formed before the atmospheric tests. And indeed, of course, they found there was a huge difference. And after 63, they carried on and they found a great drop-in in strontium-90, this radioactive isotope in teeth. And the image in the middle is reminding us about steel. It's an image of a medical instrument for measuring, one of these body scan machines, and it requires steel that doesn't have radioactivity in it, that hasn't been contaminated by atmospheric tests. And for decades, it wasn't possible to make instruments like that with new steel, because the elements that you could get had all been contaminated by radiation. And so they had to be made from steel recovered from things like ships that were scuttled before there were nuclear tests. This background level of radiation has gone down since, and it is probably now possible to make some instruments, but we're still getting a small dose that wouldn't have been there if there had never been nuclear tests. And then the leaflet here, the pamphlet, the booklet, is the kind of source that people go to look at relative doses of radiation in an average person in the planet. So they just make averages. I mean, there's obviously no such thing as an average person, but these are the tables that show actually the doses, really very small, smaller than you would get from X-rays and medical procedures, and smaller than you would get from background, natural background radiation, not the tests. But as I've said, it's not even, didn't fall evenly, and actually, the jury is out about whether even a small extra dose could sometimes trigger cancers. And in fact, the scientific orthodoxy is that it has caused hundreds of thousands of cancers, but in a context in which there are millions of cancers. So it's not the dominant cause of cancer for most people, probably, but it will be undoubtedly for some. So here is the first site of a British nuclear test, 1952. There were 3 atomic tests carried out on Montebello Islands, one in 1952 and 2 in 1956. There are still, these were uninhabited at the time, except that, of course, they weren't. There was thousands of fish and turtles and birds that were vaporized and killed as a consequence in this beautiful, beautiful place. You can visit these islands, but there are warnings not to spend more than an hour on a couple of the islands and never to disturb the soil or take away artifacts, because they are still got radiation. So in total, there were 12 atmospheric tests conducted by the British in Australia, as well as Montebello Islands. They conducted them in 2 mainland sites in South Australia, the state in the mainland of Australia, which they called Emu Fields, and sorry, I'm having a blank now, Maralinga, which is the Aboriginal name for thunder, but that wasn't actually what it was called. They named it that. And then overlapping with these tests, there were tests that they conducted in the Pacific, in what is now the country of Kiribati, or Kiribati, it's sometimes pronounced. 2 islands there. One that at the time was called Christmas Island, and the Malden Island. But they also allowed the United States to use the island in Kiribati for 24 atmospheric tests before they then went on to be restricted to underground tests by the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Now, Aboriginal people were never warned about these tests. So the very first test in Montebello Islands produced more radiation than expected, which went onto the mainland and contaminated some areas of Aboriginal peoples. And all of the tests on the mainland were on Aboriginal land, and the site at Maralinga was actually in an important transit area for Aboriginal people on their sort of visits of sacred sites, right in the middle of. And there were no notices in their language and no real effort. This is Yami Lester, a very well-known Aboriginal activist, talking about his own experience. Now wait a minute. Can you hear that? Oh, you can't. Good.
In 1950s, there was a British government and Australian government made agreement to have a bomb testing in Australia. They're not far from here, and I was only a little kid. They were working there testing bombs, and the first one they let it go was called Totem 1. We heard it here loud and clear and feel the ground shook. We seen radiation full out over our camp. It was moving very quietly and very deadly. After that I went blind on the right eye straight away, and on the left I had some sight left.
So well, it's obvious that if you're living in the open, not in a house, and living off the land, drinking the water, eating produce from the land, which is how the traditional lifestyle of still being followed by many Aboriginal people, that you would be very vulnerable to radiation. But there was no, as I said, real effort to do anything to prevent harm. And Yami Lester and others campaigned for years to have the effects investigated. And eventually, in the 1980s, there was a Royal Commission. But it had to conclude that because there was no proper data gathered at the time, there was no real prospect of finding out what harm had really been done. So Yami Lester and others talked about deaths, about people dying, older people dying of radiation sickness, described illnesses that are consistent with that, but they couldn't. There wasn't evidence. No evidence had been gathered. But it was clear that insufficient resources had ever been allocated to making people safe, and that false assumptions about the area being empty were used, and that Aboriginal people had been denied access to their traditional lands, and that research needed even now to be done in the 1980s, it was being said, because people were still living in areas where there might be particles of plutonium and contamination getting into their food. So I'm moving now on to the tests in the Pacific, and in the British called grapple that Stephen mentioned before we started. And these were thermonuclear hydrogen bomb tests. So that is where you use basically a nuclear bomb to set off a fusion reaction to make an even bigger bomb. So it's even more radiation, more everything, bigger fireball, bigger mushroom cloud, more radiation, more stuff completely vaporized, but also more lasting harm. Kiribati or Kiribati became a nation state in 1979. So at this time, these islands were they were colonial possessions of the British, and the population, of course, are not consulted about their use in this way. They scattered over a very large area, the nation of Kiribati. And the number of people involved in this was huge. So there were thousands and thousands of military and civilian personnel taking part in these tests, from not just from Britain, but also from the United States, from New Zealand, and from Fiji. So, military servicemen were rounded up from Fiji as well. And very little protective clothing or monitoring of exposure went on. Some people did get little film badges that measure radiation, but it turned out later, when years later, when questions were asked about this, that the data were never even processed. And there are still some survivors, people who are children of the people who were there at the time, or the grandchildren, and many have got genetic problems that are consistent with exposure to radiation, and multiple health problems and multi-generational health problems. And also there's documentation at the time about the thousands of birds and fish, but very little analysis of environmental impact. And one of the things that helped lead up to the partial test ban treaty was, in Japan, people started to analyse tuna more carefully because of all the assurances they were getting from the British that everything was fine and no harm was being done. And guess what? They found that the tuna were actually contaminated. And that was a big scandal that also helped. That and the teeth were the kinds of citizen science, really, or science that wasn't official government science, that helped bring about the test ban. But those directly affected in places like Kiribati are still not compensated directly. The government still wants to deny the genetic harms to those who participated, including the veterans. So the veteran support programs that they have helped have been relatively minor, really. So this is, I think I've showed this bit of this.
It was just sheer brilliant light. So I've never seen anything like it, never had done.
In the process of hands over your eyes, you saw every bone in your hand.
If I was looking at you now, I would see all your bones. You would see all the blood vessels and everything, and the bones a lot.
Then the heat hit you, and that was just as if somebody my size had actually caught fire, then walked through me. It was an experience that was absolutely unearthing. It was so strange.
Some of the lads would stand up, but about 30 odd seconds later, you'd get the blast, and the blast would knock you flying.
And there were guys with bruises and broken limbs. We couldn't believe it.
After a while, we were told that we could now stand and look up and watch the mushroom form.
You caught sight of it at 90 degrees. It was that huge. It wasn't there, it wasn't there, it was there. It was practically above you.
All they saw was this rising fireball, a colossal fireball just going up, and thunder, lightning, you name it.
What I noticed most was the clouds moving away like that, you know, round and round and round.
I think it was too much for some of them, and some of them would cry and ask for their mum. That was awful.
There was no comprehension that anything like that could even exist. It was immense.
It's a sight to see, but never want to see it again.
Over a 10-year test period, there were 22,500 personnel. In 2013, we estimated that 18,500 of us had died. And the reports that I'd seen, nobody had died practically of natural causes. They all died of leukemias and cancers and carcinomas of one sort or the other.
Does this correspond to what radiation does to a human body?
The thing is, guys couldn't have children. People's children suffer from numerous ailments and things that come out, twisted bones.
How did it affect you and your children?
I'm going to stop it there, but they go on and talk about, various illnesses and genetic defects that their children had. And one person talks about not being able to have children at all. And they also talk about how they were discouraged very strongly from speaking. In fact, told not to speak about the tests, and didn't speak about them for decades. So I'm going to move on, but these themes are very strong, and the government still maintains that nuclear test sites, people who were there were not exposed to harmful levels of ionizing radiation. And many of the veterans advocacy organizations have been wanting an apology and an acknowledgement of harm. So in 2022, the government did announce a year of commemoration of veterans and issued new medals specifically for veterans, and put some money towards an oral history project and some funds to, well, in their words, to support activities for nuclear test veterans and educate the public on the United Kingdom's nuclear deterrence efforts. But the acknowledgement of the real harm, and it's not just the harm of radiation, that, there was an element of post-traumatic stress for some people. Not everybody, as was being said, people were not prepared for what they were about to witness. And some people never fully recovered from having seen it mentally because of the stress of it, never mind the radiation. Now, we now have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which has clauses that are explicitly about victim assistance and environmental remediation. They call on the people who join the treaty to do something for victims of testing of nuclear weapons, to provide proper medical care. And part of what people in Kiribati are concerned about, and you will hear from testimony from Australia, is that the records of what happened, even the ones that did exist, are not made available to them. The research is not being done. Nothing really is being done to help, and the medical care isn't fully there. I'm going to end with the testimony of Karen Lester, the daughter of Yami Lester, who's speaking at the second meeting of the state parties to this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that now nearly half of the countries in the world have signed up to this, but not, of course, the nuclear states.
And I'm very pleased now to turn to our fourth presenter, Ms. Karina Lester. Ms. Lester grew up in the remote community of Mimili in the far northwest of South Australia. She has a long history as a keen anti-nuclear activist, sharing not only her late father's story, but her grandmother's story of the British nuclear tests in the 1950s to 1960s, and speaks strongly about the impacts felt by her people. Karina is an ICANN ambassador and participated in the negotiating conference of the TPNW, and she's played a leading role in campaigns to prevent international nuclear waste storage in South Australia. Ms. Lester, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Secretary General. Let me get comfortable. And thank you, Mexican's presidency, Mr. President, for this amazing opportunity to be here. I'm no scientist. I'm going to be speaking as a second-generation survivor of the British nuclear tests. Before I do want to acknowledge that I am on traditional lands of Turtle Island, but I want to acknowledge First Nations peoples who are present in this room as well. As I mentioned, I'm a second-generation survivor, and I'm speaking from my people's impact felt by the British nuclear tests that took place in 1953. And in Australia, it continued that program through the 50s and 60s as well. Renee, I'm going to get a slide if you can. So my late father, Yami Lester, was a young boy at the age of 12 when Totem 1 detonated on his traditional lands at Emu Fields. He went blind 4 years later at the age of 16. His parents were living in a very remote community in South Australia. It was a pastoral property at the time, a place called Wallatinna, which is where I currently reside as well. This black mist fell over the community in that 1953, and that was 70 years ago when the black mist rolled over that community. Old people had died, and many became violently ill. And as my father, after 4 years, a gradual loss of his sight, illness was unfolded in the next generations and generations to come as well. And sickness is through our communities, 70 years ago through to 2023 as well. People suffered and still suffer to this day. We know our lands are poisoned. We know the radiation fallout killed our loved ones. We know the fallout contaminated our country, our traditional lands, but also our families and our people who move through those traditional lands. We know that our home, the remote community, the station that I live on, in the middle of Australia, had high levels of radiation fallout. Dad passed on 2017, the day or the month after I had come back from presenting in this very room at the 2017 negotiations that happened. I got back into Australia in July that year. Dad had passed as well. So it's important for myself to continue on the legacy of his story and to talk about the impacts felt by First Nations peoples and our community in particular in remote South Australia and in the centre of Australia as well. Next slide, please, Renee. I can click. I want to acknowledge these amazing old women who have been a part of my life for decades, but they were also survivors and witnesses of those British nuclear tests. We are the ones that know the real human impact of nuclear. These amazing old women were the ones who lived and who were there at the time the ground shook and the black mist rolled and that illness fell over our community. These amazing women speak very strongly and spoke very strongly about those impacts. They have the lived experience. We are grateful that the treaty recognises survivors and recognises the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous peoples across this globe. Our stories have so much in common and we share those stories with each other. The way nuclear weapons states and most of their allies talk about nuclear weapons, it's like they are totally divorced from the reality of what these weapons do and the harms that are felt by people, but also by our traditional country and our lands, our plants, our animals. The treaty was achieved through the humanitarian initiative to humanise the reality of these bombs. The treaty's success from now and into the future must continue to bring the expertise, experiences of those of us who know what they do. And our stories are real, our stories are experienced, our stories are felt. For 70 years for us in Australia, in 1953, but also the program continuing through the 60s as well. These stories are very real. The treaty marks nuclear weapons, or they make nuclear weapons illegal, but also puts obligations on states parties to make things better and important for the people and for our land, and these are our traditional lands as well. We want the recognition by the governments of the day of the harms and what they have imposed on our communities and on our people and on our traditional lands. We want the respect, and we want to start the conversations around repair, how we need to work together to fix the damages that are there. The scars are evident, the scars are on our people, and the scars are on our traditional lands. It is encouraging to hear the scientific community calling from opening of records. These are very important. We need to know the stories of how the human rights, it's our human rights to have the access to our medical records. There's a lot of misgap data in Australia of the records of our First Nations peoples or our Aboriginal people of Australia. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space as well. It is beyond time for this to be happening, where things are closed or lost conveniently or been burnt in a fire, or whatever excuses they make. These records need to be available. Unless we have access to the full information of the people who inflicted these harms and these nuclear harms on our people and land, we cannot know how to address and how to fix these. We need to know. We need to be sitting around those tables. We need to be having those conversations, because we are the solutions to the problems of what we have impacted and felt. We want more research on the health impacts, and we want more research on the environmental impacts. And impacts, I talk about intangible cultural heritage as well. Bombs removing chapters of our stories, what we call our wabar, our jugorba, in the Western Desert area of Australia. These stories are important to us. How do we bring them back? These will never be brought back. We want our contaminated lands to be cleaned up, to be removed of all the contamination that lays there still to this day, 70 years after that impact. We must be involved as Indigenous owners of the land. We want an apology. We want action. We want governments to recognise what they have done. We need state parties to work together to get moving on Articles 6 and 7. Our elders are passing, and this work on victim assistance and environmental remediation is crucial before we lose our elders. And we need all governments who haven't yet to join this treaty, including my own country, Australia. They have a responsibility to sign the ban if they want to do anything on nuclear weapons. Joining this treaty must be the #1 priority. I'll go to the next slide, please, Renee. This gives some indication of where Australia is and where the test site of Emu Field took place. We are very isolated, we're very remote, and the two mainland tests of Totem 1 and Totem 2 were at the Emu Field test site. Totem 1 was the test that took place over the traditional lands of my late father, Yami Lester, and those amazing old women who were leaders. They saw and they experienced that test, the ground shaking and the black mist rolling. There's no excuse for being out of sight, out of mind, to not hear the voices of First Nations peoples of this country that I live in Australia. It's a struggle each day to try and get our voices and our messages across to governments to hear the harms and the impacts felt. When you look at a map like this, you see very clearly in Australia that where uranium is mined on First Nations traditional lands, tests have been taking place on First Nations traditional lands, and waste is an issue. And often First Nations peoples of our country in Australia are always felt or feeling the impact of nuclear waste and our traditional lands to be that waste dump. So just within our state of South Australia, there have been many extremes and many examples of where First Nations peoples have been impacted by the testing, the mining, and the waste issues that are felt across this globe as well. Next slide. I want to end with a quote from my late father, where he says, "We heard it here, loud and clear, and felt the ground shake. We've seen the radiation fallout over our camp. It was moving very quietly and very deadly." Finally, to the observers, please double your efforts to sign this treaty. And to the state's parties, thank you for being on the right side of history, for committing to repair the past and to protect the future from these terrible weapons. Thank you.
The remediation that she calls for is still a long way off. But I think we've not got much time left, so it's now time for some questions and comments.
My name is Alan Owen. I'm an ex-chairman of the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association and the founder of Lab Rats in the UK. I wanted to say firstly, thank you very much for your presentation. The video that you showed, the Vice video you showed, just to update everybody, only one of those veterans is still alive. That's only 4 years later. The rest, unfortunately, have passed away. So their testimony being videoed at the conference that was done in 2020 when I was chairman was one which has been amazing, and that has been watched millions and millions of times. But I just wanted to update the audience to say that anybody, and I know Stephen is on, and Steve Pearce is on as well, he knows all about us, but we do help any nuclear test veteran and their families. And we have a free membership scheme at the moment. So if anybody wants to join us and visit us, just go to our website, which is labrats.international, and we can help people with this. We're working with ICANN as an ICANN partner like you are. And it just shows that despite the fantastic testimony from Karina Lester, that we need to move this forward as quickly as possible because we lose veterans. I'm off to a funeral next week for another veteran. And we need to make sure that we never forget. My father was a test veteran. He was at Operation Dominic, which was the joint UK-US test in '62. And he witnessed 24 detonations in 78 days before that test ban treaty came into play. But I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. It was very good.
Thank you very much for being here, Alan, and for telling people about Lab Rats, which I think is a fantastic organisation. Thank you. I read your stuff, and it's always very good. Thank you.
I think Margaret has her hand up.
Margaret, please.
The situation we're in just now with threats of nuclear Armageddon. Is there any chance of us using the testimonies of these people to make people understand that nuclear weapons are not a deterrent? They don't make sense.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. Yes, I think that is a very important message that, I mean, the whole idea of deterrence is totally illogical, really. I mean, there's many arguments against deterrence. I mean, there's been many conflicts. It is the case that also, holding the whole world to ransom in the sense of, a threat of destruction that would be so profound that none of us would have livable lives. And calling that defense, it's just somewhat insane, but showing that it's caused all kinds of ongoing harm and is continuing to cause ongoing harm, I think is an important part of the story. So yes, I think the more we can talk about this and the more get people thinking about what nuclear weapons really are like, what they really do, even testing them does, but the uranium mining does, the waste that they produce does. The more we can get people to think about these things, the more people will perhaps accept that the best way forward is to step back completely and work towards complete prohibition. Tor.
I just, being somebody who's been involved with anti-nuclear campaigns for many years, both opposed to weapons and opposed to nuclear power, I just wonder how often people are aware of the direct link between nuclear power and the production of plutonium and the production of weapons. Last year, interestingly, in a government paper, they didn't say it in so many words, but they as much admitted that there was a link which they had always denied before. And a few years ago, the French government came out with the same statement, a similar statement. So to me, it's as important to campaign against nuclear power as it is to campaign against nuclear weapons, because you can't, as the old song goes, you can't have one without the other. And I just hope that message, I'm sure it is amongst this audience, but in talking to people generally, I just want to make the point that it's important, I think, to stress the close link between the two, and that we have to campaign vigorously against new nuclear, which is what this current government and the previous government are proposing. So we're not rid of nuclear weapons yet, and we're not rid of nuclear power yet. In fact, nuclear power is going the opposite way. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you, Tor. Thank you very much for that. Yes, of course, I agree. And also, I think the government's support of nuclear power cannot be rationally explained except because of the link. They need a certain stock of scientists who are working in nuclear industries to keep designing nuclear weapons, and they need nuclear power to help keep the whole show on the road in multiple senses, not just the plutonium issue, but the kind of infrastructure of research and development is shared between the two, the civil and the military industry. And, the expense of nuclear power is phenomenally larger than solar or wind power in particular. It isn't needed. There's no rational explanation for why they're going for it. And of course, they both rely on uranium mining and generate huge amounts of nuclear waste for which there's no solution. So they add to the environmental harms terribly. Anyone want to come in with anything else?
I see that Jackie has her hand up, and also Steve. I'm not sure who was first.
Can I just say that having read lots of the research and going back over historical data, there's been lots of stories. We start off with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and taking statements from people, and this continues to the nuclear tests that Britain were part of, where we take stories, we take histories. But what we're not doing is getting redress for people like me as a descendant. It's time to actually hold the governments to account. And it appears that historically, the messages and the histories are being used to sidestep us into campaigning. And whilst that is admirable, I cannot knock that in any shape or form. That seems to be an agenda on its own. And I think that now we have to stand firm and say, no. I mean, my father died last year. It's too late for him, but it's not too late for me. It's not too late for my son. And I think we really need to stand firm and be very, very vocal now about saying to the British government in particular, it's time to put your hand in your pocket and pay these people, not just listen to their stories.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. I'd wonder if Alan or Lab Rats want to come back in.
Yep, I will do. I'll come back on that. Yeah, we've got Jackie, contact us because we've got a legal case going on at the moment with the MOD, which is about to be stepped up.
Yes, I am part of that, Alan.
You're part of that, it's good. But we also need, and Steve's going to talk about this in a minute, I think, really now with the new Labour government, this is the time. This is the time now that we have a short window to bring them to account, because we've had lots of promises in opposition like we've had before. And lots of people on this call have been there before. But this time we cannot let it slip, and we cannot let them not and just bat it out again. With Hillsborough Law coming through, we need to make sure that they are held to account. Definitely that there is things coming along, and there will be a new BBC documentary that is coming in the end of November, hopefully beginning of December, somewhere like that, that Steve and I have been involved in, that will be really, really highlight that. It's a 75-minute documentary on BBC Two that's coming.
Great, thank you. Stephen, do you want to come in? Steve, sorry, on you go.
Yes, as Alan said, I work quite closely with him campaigning for Lab Rats. I think now, Alan's right, now is the time, because we do need to get these problems sorted, because it's one thing to say this is a problem that affects, I think in the public eye, a lot of people think it affects the group of veterans, and that's where it stops, but it doesn't. It's the descendants, I think, as a lot of us know, myself included. My father served at Maralinga, which Karina Lester was talking about. I have disabilities. I was born with them, they're genetic. And like many of us in the community, one of my conditions is completely unique, can't be diagnosed. And it is going down the generations. I've got a 3-year-old son who has a genetic problem with his teeth. Again, Karina talked about the teeth issue. There was a video about problems with teeth. So now is the time, because children are being born every day in the community, and the health problems are continuing and continuing and continuing. We have had promises made by Labour and opposition, and we do need to hold to account. So, yeah, if anyone can get behind us and help, and obviously join us in the legal case, that would be fantastic, because this is our moment, and I really believe that.
Great. If there's stuff that you want us to advertise through Scottish C&D, we will kind of try and post, keep our members aware of what you're doing. That would be good.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're doing some stuff with Welsh C&D at the moment, so I've done an article for their magazine, so that'd be great. That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else want to come in? We've just got a couple of minutes left. Stephen Taylor, do you want to come back? You spoke at the beginning before you were, I don't know if you want to say anything.
I think Margaret's got a question.
Margaret, do you want to come in? Or is that a legacy hand?
Just to say that I have photocopied 500 copies of the leaflet, How Will a Nuclear Strike Affect You? Because people do not understand why we cannot take the risk. I will deliver them all in my village with the help of some friends.
That's wonderful, Margaret. That's just brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a piece of great action on your part. Thank you. Okay. Anyone else want to come in then?
Can I just add one thing to your thing? Just to let you know that there is a new educational video that we've done that will be made available once it's been passed by the OVA. That was part of the funding process when they said about education. Steve has narrated a video for us, and there is a new video coming. It's about 15 minutes long. And when it's released, it will be available to everybody in schools and everything else to talk about the legacy of the nuclear tests. And it's specifically the British nuclear testing with every programme. So there are things that are coming. It takes a little bit of a while. We all know the government works in very slowly. But there are things that are afoot, and we will keep everybody updated, especially the CND movement, exactly what's happening, so that you can come and visit us and see what's going on and share as much as possible. But to everybody that's been on this call, I find it brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much for everybody's participation.